5:45 in the morning. The Philippine Sea, 800 miles east of the Luzon Strait. The USS Harry Truman was carving a wide, white wake through the deep indigo of the Pacific when the first thermal spike registered on the satellite downlinks at Pacific Command. The supercarrier had been maintaining a high-speed sprint to the northeast for 12 hours, its nuclear reactors pushing the 100,000-ton hull at a steady 32 knots to reposition for a dawn launch. Inside the Combat Direction Center, the air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and recycled oxygen, a sharp contrast to the humid, salt-heavy wind whipping across the 4.5-acre flight deck above. The rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the ship's machinery was the only constant until the primary air defense officer saw the first icons bloom on his console in a violent shade of red. Something was coming from the Chinese mainland, and it was moving at a speed that traditional cruise missile defenses were never designed to handle. The radar operators on the escorting Aegis destroyers were the first to confirm the nightmare. 300 miles to the west, the destroyer USS Mason and the cruiser USS Normandy were operating as the strike group's outer kinetic shield, their AN/SPY-6 radar arrays pulsing with millions of watts of energy. The sensors tracked 6 distinct objects rising out of the northern coastal regions of China, climbing rapidly through the stratosphere until they reached the edge of space. These were DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, known in naval intelligence circles as the carrier killers, each one designed to deliver a maneuverable re-entry vehicle onto a moving target from 3,000 kilometers away. The atmosphere in the Truman's command center shifted instantly from professional routine to the calculated urgency of a crew that knew they were seconds away from a catastrophe. General quarters was sounded, the haunting, two-tone alarm echoing through every passageway and berthing compartment from the keel to the mast. 5,000 sailors and Marines scrambled to their stations, sliding down steep ladders and dogging heavy steel hatches as the ship's internal lights flipped to a low, tactical red. The physical sensation of the ship changed as the captain ordered a hard turn to starboard, the massive deck tilting 10 degrees under the force of the maneuver as the Truman attempted to complicate the enemy's final targeting solution. Above the deck, the pre-dawn sky was still a pale, bruised purple, but the environment was no longer peaceful. The sharp, chemical stench of jet fuel became overpowering as flight deck crews worked in the dark to secure aircraft that were mid-service. Steam hissed from the catapult tracks, and the wind shrieked through the radio masts as the carrier's speed increased. Far above the cloud layer, the 6 DF-26 warheads reached their apogee and began their terminal descent, gravity and rocket boosters accelerating them to Mach 18. The air around the falling warheads began to ionize, turning into a white-hot plasma that blotted out the stars. The carrier strike group was no longer just a projection of American power. It was a target in a high-speed physics problem where the margin for error was measured in microseconds. On the USS Mason, the Mark 41 vertical launch systems were already primed, the steel doors ready to fly, open to release the first wave of interceptors. The crew of the Truman could do nothing but watch the telemetry and wait for the impact of a weapon system that had spent decades in development for this exact moment. The silence on the bridge was absolute, broken only by the clipped, robotic voice of the tactical action officer reporting the diminishing range of the incoming fire. The first salvo of the war had been fired, and the Philippine Sea was about to become a graveyard of steel and fire. 6 in the morning. The coastal highlands of Guangdong province, 3,000 kilometers to the west of the Philippine Sea. The mobile launch vehicles of the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, massive 16-wheeled transporters carrying the DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, had been repositioned under the cover of a dense regional weather system for 3 consecutive nights. Each 10-ton missile sat encased in its canister, a weapon specifically engineered over 2 decades to challenge the supremacy of the United States Navy's carrier strike groups within the second island chain. The air in the launch valley was thick with the scent of wet pine and the sharp metallic tang of specialized hydraulic fluid. As the crews executed their final firing sequence, these batteries represented the tip of a spear that the Chinese High Command had sharpened for the express purpose of pushing American influence back toward the Central Pacific. The presence of the USS Harry Truman in the Philippine Sea was not a matter of chance, but a deliberate strategic response to the escalating blockade of the Luzon Strait and the Northern Mariana Islands. For 6 months, the Indo-Pacific Command had observed a systematic buildup of anti-access and area denial capabilities that threatened to sever the vital maritime lifelines between Hawaii, Guam, and the regional allies in the West. The Truman was the center of a 60-vessel naval task force tasked with breaking this blockade, a mission that required the carrier to operate within the lethal envelope of land-based ballistic missiles. The geopolitical stakes were binary. Either the United States would maintain its freedom of navigation in these waters, or it would cede the Western Pacific to a new and aggressive hegemon. The DF-26, often referred to by military analysts as the Guam Killer, was a 2-stage solid-fuel missile, capable of carrying a maneuverable re-entry vehicle that could adjust its flight path during the final seconds of its descent. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles that follow a predictable parabolic arc, the DF-26 utilized an active terminal radar seeker to lock on to the specific electromagnetic signature of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. This capability turned the vastness of the ocean into a trap, as the speed of the weapon meant that from the moment of launch to the moment of impact, the carrier's crew had less than 12 minutes to react. The logistical effort to sustain these mobile batteries was immense, involving a web of underground facilities, decoy vehicles, and a sophisticated satellite network designed to provide real-time targeting data. Tactically, the People's Liberation Army aimed to overwhelm the Truman's defensive screens through a saturation attack, launching multiple warheads from different vectors to force the Aegis combat system to prioritize targets under extreme duress. By firing a mix of older DF-21 Delta and the newer, more capable DF-26 variants, the attackers hoped to deplete the supply of Standard Missile 3 and Standard Missile 6 interceptors carried by the escorting destroyers and cruisers. Each interceptor fired by the American ships cost millions of dollars and occupied a precious cell in the Mark 41 vertical launch systems, which could only be replenished at a specialized naval port or through a high-risk sea transfer. The math of the engagement favored the attacker, as a single successful hit could neutralize a multi-billion-dollar asset and thousands of highly trained personnel. As the missiles roared into the upper atmosphere, their white-hot exhaust plumes carving scars across the pre-dawn sky of mainland China, the strategic objective became chillingly clear to the commanders at Pacific Command in Hawaii. This was not a warning shot or a demonstration of force, but a coordinated attempt to sink a frontline American supercarrier and fundamentally alter the global naval order in a single morning. The environment surrounding the launch sites remained eerily still after the contextus. Thunder of the engines faded, leaving only the smell of burnt propellant and the distant, low rumble of the returning storm. Across the Pacific, the digital countdown on the screens of the 7th Fleet headquarters indicated that the first warheads would reach their terminal phase in less than 4 minutes. The decision to deploy the Truman into this lethal corridor had been debated at the highest levels of the Pentagon, with logistics experts warning that a damaged carrier would have almost no friendly ports capable of providing the necessary dry dock repairs within 3,000 miles. The carrier was operating at the very edge of its logistical tether, relying on a constant flow of supply ships and aerial tankers to maintain its defensive posture and its strike capability. If the flight deck was compromised, the Truman would be transformed from a formidable weapon of war into a 100,000-ton liability that would require the entire strike group to protect while it limped toward safety. The stage was set for a collision of technologies and doctrines that would determine the future of the Pacific for the next 50 years. 6:05 in the morning. The Philippine Sea, 80 miles west of the carrier's current position. The destroyer, USS Mason, DDG-87, and the cruiser USS Normandy, CG-60, were no longer just escorts. They were the thin, kinetic line between the Harry Truman and a supersonic death falling from the edge of space. The ANSPY-6 radar arrays on the Mason were pulsing at maximum power the massive cooling system struggling against the heat generated by the sheer volume of data being processed as the ship's computers calculated intercept solutions for the 6 incoming warheads. The air on the Mason's bridge was thick with the smell of floor wax and electronic heat, a stark contrast to the violent, high-speed geometry unfolding on the tactical displays where red icons moved at 10 times the speed of a rifle bullet inside the hulls of the escort ships. The command to engage was executed with a series of muffled thuds that vibrated through the steel decks like a hammer hitting an anvil. In the Mark 41 vertical launch systems, the protective steel hatches of the cells blew open in rapid succession, followed immediately by the roar of solid-fuel rocket boosters as the first wave of Standard Missile 3 interceptors clawed for altitude. These missiles were designed for exo-atmospheric engagement, screaming into the thin air of the upper atmosphere to meet the Chinese warheads while they were still in the vacuum of space, thousands of miles above the surface of the ocean. The logistics of this defensive shield were as unforgiving as the physics of the engagement itself. Each Standard Missile 3 interceptor occupied a single cell in the vertical launch system, and once fired, those cells could not be reloaded while the ship was underway at sea. The Mason and Normandy were carrying a combined total of 122 kinetic interceptors, a finite magazine that had to be managed with surgical precision against a saturation strike that could be followed by a second or third wave at any moment. The commanding officers of the escort ships were forced into a grim calculation, weighing the necessity of a 2-to-1 shot ratio for every incoming warhead against the terrifying possibility of running dry before the morning was over. As the Standard Missile 3 interceptors reached their intercept points, the kill vehicles detached from the missile bodies, using their own infrared seekers and small thrusters to align themselves with the falling DF-26 warheads. This was hitting a bullet with a bullet on a continental scale. A collision of kinetic energy that produced no traditional explosion but instead shattered the targets into thousands of fragments of superheated titanium and steel. 3 of the 6 incoming red icons vanished from the tactical screens of the 7th Fleet, replaced by white clouds representing debris fields that would burn up harmlessly in the atmosphere. The tension on the bridge of the Truman broke for a fraction of a second, but it was a premature relief. The remaining 3 warheads were not following standard ballistic trajectories. They were the maneuverable variants of the DF-26, and they had executed a high-G pull-up maneuver that took them outside the optimal engagement envelope of the exo-atmospheric interceptors. These warheads were now plunging back into the atmosphere at a speed of Mach 12, their ceramic heat shields glowing with the intensity of a dying star as they compressed the air into a wall of white-hot plasma. The defensive strategy shifted instantly to the inner layer as the Mason and Normandy prepared to launch the Standard Missile 6, a multi-mission weapon designed for terminal phase intercepts within the atmosphere, where the targets could still twist and turn. The environment of the strike group was now a chaotic symphony of outgoing fire and incoming terror. The sky above the escort ships was crisscrossed with the white, corkscrewing trails of interceptors, the air smelling of acrid sulfur and the ozone of the radar arrays. Below the waterline, the sonar technicians heard the distant, rhythmic thrum of the Truman's 4 massive brass propellers. As the carrier continued its desperate zigzag through the heavy swells, the sailors in the engine rooms felt the hull shudder with every launch. From the nearby destroyers, the shock waves traveling through the water and through the steel beneath their feet, a constant reminder that the shield was being tested to its absolute limit. 2 of the remaining warheads were successfully engaged by the Standard Missile 6 battery, the interceptions occurring less than 20 miles from the carrier at an altitude of 40,000 feet. The double detonations bleached the sky white for 3 full seconds, the shock waves rattling the windows of the Truman's primary flight control tower like a physical punch. But as the smoke cleared, 1 red icon remained on the screens, moving at 5 kilometers per second and locked onto the thermal signature of the carrier's nuclear reactors. The Aegis shield had performed at 95% efficiency. But in the math of carrier warfare, anything less than 100% was a sentence of destruction. The final warhead was now in its terminal dive, less than 10 seconds from impact. The crew of the Truman felt the ship's point defense systems, the rolling airframe missiles, and the 20mm close-in weapon systems erupt in a desperate, last-second wall of lead and fire. The sound was like a giant chainsaw cutting through the air, a deafening mechanical scream that drowned out the wind and the sea. The final layer of the defense was active, but the physics of the DF-26 meant that even a disabled warhead would still carry enough kinetic energy to tear through the carrier like a hot needle through silk. 6:08 in the morning. The Philippine Sea, latitude 15 degrees north, longitude 135 degrees east. The terminal phase of the DF-26 warhead lasted less than 4 seconds, a blurring streak of white-hot plasma that the human eye could barely track against the pale dawn sky. On the starboard quarter of the USS Harry Truman, the phalanx close-in weapon system erupted in a desperate, continuous stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds, the mechanical scream of the Gatling gun vibrating through the entire island superstructure. The weapon fired at a rate of 75 rounds per second, creating a wall of metal that shredded the outer ceramic skin of the warhead. But the momentum of a half-ton object moving at Mach 12 was an elemental force that could not be stopped by lead alone. The warhead punched through the 4-inch thick hardened steel of the flight deck. Just aft of the number 4 elevator, the kinetic energy alone instantly vaporizing the landing signal officer's platform. The impact was not a single explosion, but a sequence of structural failures as the re-entry vehicle drove through 3 decks of reinforced steel before the proximity fuse detonated deep within the ship's secondary aviation fuel lines. A fireball of pressurized JP-5 jet fuel, reaching temperatures of over 2,000 degrees, roared upward through the entry hole and outward through the narrow passageways of the gallery deck. The shockwave was so violent that it buckled the heavy steel beams of the hangar bay ceiling, sending 10-ton overhead cranes crashing onto the parked aircraft below. The defenders' reaction was immediate and fueled by the primal instinct of a crew trained for the end of the world. In the hangar bay, the sailors of Repair Locker 5 were thrown off their feet by a blast wave that compressed their chests and shattered every light fixture in a 50-meter radius. As the emergency red lighting flickered on, the damage control team scrambled into their heavy fire-retardant suits, the air already thick with the acrid, suffocating smell of burning rubber and hydraulic fluid. They dragged heavy hoses toward a wall of orange flame that was licking at the wings of 2 FA-18 Super Hornets, their boots slipping on a lethal mixture of seawater, foam, and spilled fuel that was washing across the deck as the ship listed 5 degrees to starboard. On the flight deck, the scene was one of industrial-scale devastation. The hole ripped by the missile was 40 feet wide, its edges glowing a dull, angry red, where the steel had been flash-melted by the friction of the entry. A line of parked EA-18 Gulf Growlers had been swept toward the edge of the deck. By the initial blast, their airframes twisted and shredded like discarded soda cans. Medics from the ship's surgical suite scrambled onto the deck with stretchers, moving through a swirling fog of white firefighting foam and black smoke to reach sailors who had been caught in the open. The wind, usually a cooling presence, now acted as a bellows, driving the heat of the internal fires across the flight deck and making coordination nearly impossible. The immediate aftermath was marked by a sudden, haunting shift in the ship's mechanical voice. The steady, reassuring hum of the ventilation system died as the damage control officer ordered the isolation of the affected zones to prevent the fire from reaching the reactor shielding. Below the waterline, the sound of the ocean rushing into the ruptured void spaces created a low, guttural roar that could be felt in the soles of the sailors' boots. The radio nets, which had been a chaotic storm of reports, went silent for 5 long seconds as the command team on the bridge looked aft at the pillar of black smoke, rising 600 feet into the air. The USS Harry Truman, the centerpiece of American power in the Pacific, was no longer an aggressor. It was a wounded giant, fighting for its life. Deep within the hull, the condition zebra orders were being enforced with grim finality, as sailors dogged down hatches that they knew their shipmates were still behind. The decision to seal a compartment to save the ship was the heaviest burden a commanding officer could carry, and the metallic clanging of those hatches echoed through the dying smoke like a funeral bell. The carrier's speed began to bleed off, dropping from 30 knots to 15 as the engineers struggled to compensate for the sudden shift in weight and the loss of two main electrical switchboards. The first blow had landed with catastrophic precision, and the logistical nightmare of maintaining a combat posture while hemorrhaging personnel and fuel was only just beginning. 6:12 in the morning. Below the flight deck of the USS Harry Truman. In the narrow, smoke-choked corridors of the gallery deck and hangar bay, the USS Harry Truman was no longer a weapon of war. It was a 100,000-ton trauma ward and an industrial-scale firefighting operation. The air inside the ship had turned into a toxic soup of atomized hydraulic fluid, burnt plastic, and the metallic tang of blood, forced through the ventilation shafts by the overpressure of the explosion. In the main triage station, located in the ship's mess decks, the floors were slick with a mixture of seawater and red fluid, making it difficult for the medical teams to maintain their footing as they worked under the flickering emergency lights. The chief surgeon, his white gown already stained dark, coordinated the treatment of 85 personnel who had been caught in the initial blast, their injuries ranging from severe flash burns to complex fractures caused by the structural collapse of the deck. The logistics of survival became a desperate race against the clock as the damage control officer ordered the mass casualty protocol to be executed across all 17 decks. This required the mobilization of every available sailor not engaged in firefighting to act as litter bearers, moving the wounded through vertical trunks and narrow scuttles that were often blocked by warped steel or rising water. Because the primary medical elevators had been knocked out of service by the electrical surge, the crew had to form human chains, passing stretchers up 45-degree ladders, while the ship continued to heave in the heavy 4-meter swells of the Philippine Sea. Each movement was a calculated risk, as the heat from the fires in the aviation fuel lines had turned the surrounding bulkheads into glowing radiators that could melt the rubber soles of a sailor's boots in minutes. On the flight deck, the logistics of clearing the time landing area became the primary focus for the air boss, who watched from the smoke-blackened windows of the primary flight control tower. 12 F-18 Super Hornets and 4 EA-18 Golf Growlers were still airborne, their fuel gauges dropping toward the bingo levels that would force the pilots to either ditch in the open ocean or find a way to land on a deck that was currently on fire. To create a landing strip, the deck crews had to use heavy-duty tractors to push the blackened, twisted wreckage of 3 destroyed aircraft over the side of the ship and into the sea. Each $20 million fighter jet that splashed into the water represented a massive loss of combat power, but it was a necessary sacrifice to save the lives of the pilots circling overhead. In the gathering dawn, the firefighting effort was a massive consumer of the ship's resources, requiring the continuous pumping of aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF, through the overhead sprinkler systems and manual hoses. The ship's primary reservoir held 30,000 gallons of the chemical concentrate, but the rate of consumption was so high that the logistics teams were already breaking into the emergency reserve canisters stored in the lower holds. The environment in the hangar bay was a surreal nightmare of white foam, which rose to the waist of the sailors as they fought to contain a secondary fire in the oxygen generation room. The sound was a constant, deafening roar of high-pressure water and the rhythmic thud of the ship's emergency diesel generators, which were now providing the only power to the critical damage control systems. By 6:30 in the morning, the first of the airborne fighters began its emergency recovery, the pilot fighting the turbulent air. Currents created by the heat rising from the hole in the flight deck, the aircraft slammed onto the remaining 300 feet of usable deck, its tailhook catching the number 3 wire with a violent jerk that sent a shower of sparks across the foam-covered steel. The logistics of the recovery were flawless as the deck crews sprinted into the smoke to fuel and rearm the aircraft. Even as the fires raged less than 50 feet away, the Truman was fighting to regain its breath. But the technical reality was grim. The ship had lost 40% of its internal communications, and the primary radar array was beginning to fail. as the heat reached the sensitive electronics in the island superstructure. The human cost was being tallied in the dark corners of the ship, where the dead man's collection point had been established in the refrigerated stores. The chaplain moved between the wounded and the dying, his voice barely audible over the screaming of the ventilation fans, providing whatever comfort he could in a space that smelled of ozone and despair. The strike group commander, watching the tactical feed from the cruiser USS Normandy, knew that the Chinese batteries on the mainland were likely already reloading for a second salvo. The window for stabilizing the Truman was closing, and the logistical tether that connected the carrier to the rest of the 7th Fleet was being stretched to the point of total failure. 6:40 in the morning, the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea. The second wave of DF-26 missiles had cleared the atmosphere 4 minutes ago and were now entering their high-speed terminal descent toward the coordinates of the crippled carrier. On the Chinese mainland, the launch crews were already retracting the hydraulic arms of their massive mobile transporters, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and the heavy, lingering smell of burnt propellant in the humid morning air. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, casting a long, bloody orange light across a sea that was churned into a violent froth of white water and gray smoke from the first engagement. The USS Harry Truman, listing 6 degrees and trailing a thick plume of oily black soot, was a silhouette of industrial tragedy against the brightening sky. The logistical reality of the strike group was now reaching a breaking point as the destroyer USS Mason and the cruiser USS Normandy reported. Their vertical launch cells were 85% depleted. The Aegis combat systems were forced to prioritize the most lethal threats, ignoring the incoming decoys, and focusing every remaining kilowatt of radar energy on the 2 warheads that showed the most stable tracking on the Truman's hull. The air on the bridge of the Mason was a pressurized vacuum of tension, the only sound the high-pitched whine of the cooling fans and the rhythmic, electronic chirping of the incoming missile warnings. The crew had been at battle stations for 4 hours, their faces pale, under the tactical red lighting, their hands steady, but slick with sweat as they prepared for the final defensive roll of the dice. The trigger was squeezed on the Mason's console, and the ship's final 4 Standard Missile 6 interceptors shrieking off the deck in a series of white-hot flashes that momentarily blinded the lookouts on the bridge. The missiles punched through the low-hanging cloud layer, their solid fuel boosters leaving a jagged trail of white smoke that hung in the air like a scar against the orange dawn. One interceptor successfully found its mark 30 miles out, the collision creating a brilliant, silent flash of light that turned the clouds into a glowing canopy of gold for a fraction of a second. But the second warhead, a maneuverable re-entry vehicle with an advanced infrared seeker, executed a violent 6G barrel roll that took it past the final interceptor and into the inner defensive zone. The warhead, moving at 10 times the speed of sound, drove straight through the side of the hull just above the waterline, punching into the hangar bay with the force of a falling mountain hitting a sheet of glass. The warhead did not detonate immediately. Instead, it tumbled through the crowded interior of the ship, shredding through 3 parked helicopters and 2 fuel transfer stations before its proximity. Fuse triggered deep inside the ordnance elevator trunk. The impact ignited the ready-to-use missiles and 20mm ammunition stored for the next air sortie, creating a massive sympathetic detonation that blew the heavy steel hangar doors 500 feet into the air like they were made of paper. The shockwave was a physical wall of pressure that flattened every sailor within 100 yards, the heat so intense that it turned the firefighting foam into a toxic, boiling vapor in an instant. Inside the hangar, the pressure wave from the explosion compressed the air until it reached the temperature of the sun, incinerating the secondary damage control teams before they could even scream. The ship groaned, a deep, metallic scream of tearing steel that rose from the very keel as the second strike severed the main propulsion shafts to the 2 outboard propellers and fractured the primary cooling lines for the forward nuclear reactor. The deck beneath the sailors' feet jumped 3 feet into the air, throwing men against the overhead bulkheads and snapping the tie-down chains of the remaining aircraft like they were made of string. A fireball the size of a city block erupted from the side of the ship, the orange flames licking. the water as the carrier took on a sudden, sickening roll to the port side. The immediate aftermath was a scene of absolute, unmitigated chaos as the internal communications of the Truman finally went dark, leaving the individual repair lockers to fight their own private wars. In the suffocating blackness, a new, thicker pillar of oily black smoke erupted from the jagged hole in the side of the hull, blending with the fire from the first strike to blot out the morning sun and turn the sea into a landscape of shadow and ash. The sound of the ocean rushing into the hangar bay was a low, hungry growl that could be heard even over the roar of the fires, a reminder that the ship was no longer just fighting heat, but the weight of the Pacific itself. The Truman had been struck twice, and as the ship's speed dropped to a crawl, the question was no longer if the carrier could fight, but if it could stay afloat long enough for the escort ships to reach the survivors. Black smoke rose from the gaping wound in the carrier's side, and the sea around the ship was littered with burning debris and the bright white patches of fire-extinguishing foam. The radio channels of the strike group, which had been a frantic storm of data and orders, fell into a dead silence for exactly 10 seconds as every sailor across the fleet watched the pride of the Navy begin to settle deeper into the water. Then, the silence was shattered by the voice of the strike group commander, his tone cold and flat, ordering the USS Mason and the USS Normandy to prepare their Tomahawk cruise missiles for a retaliatory strike against the mainland batteries. The battle had entered a new, more desperate phase, and the cost of the engagement was now written in the smoke rising from the 100,000-ton tomb of the Harry Truman. 6:50 in the morning. The Philippine Sea and the airspace over the Luzon Strait. The destroyer, USS Mason, and the cruiser, USS Normandy, were already turning their bows toward the Chinese mainland when the encrypted execute order arrived from Pacific Command in Hawaii. The ships were operating in a state of cold, mechanical fury,
Locking on target now.
their decks still trembling from the shock waves of the carrier's explosions, but their weapon systems were functioning with the flawless precision of a pre-programmed machine. On the Mason, the tactical Tomahawk weapons control system had already ingested the satellite coordinates for the mobile launch sites in Guangdong province, transmitted from a constellation of deep space infrared sensors that had tracked the heat signatures of the earlier DF-26 launches. The retaliation began with a sound that was different from the sharp crack of the air defense interceptors. It was a sustained, low-frequency roar, as 60 Tomahawk land attack missiles were ripple-fired from the Mark 41 vertical launch systems of the two escort ships. The missiles emerged from the decks in a continuous stream of fire, their white-hot exhaust plumes carving a forest of smoke trails against the bruised purple of the western sky. Each missile, a 3,000-pound cylinder of high explosives and sophisticated guidance electronics, transitioned instantly from vertical flight to a low-altitude cruise, its stubby wings popping open as the turbojet engine kicked in with a high-pitched whine. The environment on the decks of the Mason and Normandy was one of suffocating heat and the thick, sulfurous smell of rocket propellant that hung in the humid air long after the last missile had cleared the rail. The tactical objective was the total neutralization of the mobile missile brigades before they could reload and fire a third salvo. To achieve this, the Tomahawks were programmed to fly a terrain-following profile, hugging the wavetops of the Philippine Sea at 500 miles per hour to remain below the radar horizon of the Chinese coastal defense network. This was a sophisticated logistical exercise in timing and coordination, as the missiles were routed to enter the mainland through different entry gates simultaneously, overwhelming the local air defenses through sheer volume and speed. The strike group's remaining E-2, Charlie Hawkeye, which had barely survived the initial attack, acted as a high-altitude data relay, providing mid-course corrections to the missiles as the mobile launchers attempted to scurry back into their hardened underground tunnels. Logistically, the launch of 60 Tomahawks represented a near-total depletion of the strike group's long-range offensive magazine. The Mason and Normandy were now functionally empty in terms of land attack capability, transformed from formidable multi-mission platforms into defensive shells that could only protect themselves with short-range guns and point defense missiles. This was a one-shot gamble by the 7th Fleet, a desperate attempt to decapitate the enemy's long-range fire capability before the carrier succumbed to its wounds. The refueling and rearming of these ships would now require a high-stakes rendezvous with an ammunition supply vessel, a task that would have to be performed under the shadow of a contested airspace and a potentially hostile sea. 3,000 kilometers to the west, the first Tomahawks crossed the coastline of China, their onboard cameras and radar seekers identifying the specific thermal signatures of the 16-wheeled transporter erector launchers. The missiles did not follow a straight line. They executed complex, pre-programmed maneuvers to avoid known surface-to-air missile batteries, weaving through river valleys and around coastal hills. The environment on the mainland was no longer one of quiet preparation. The Chinese batteries were in a frantic race to stow their equipment and move. But the Tomahawks were faster. The sky over the Guangdong launch sites was suddenly filled with the scream of incoming turbojets, a sound that signaled the transition from a one-sided bombardment to a two-way war of attrition. The impact of the 60 Tomahawks was a series of rolling thunderclaps that echoed through the launch valleys, each 1,000-pound warhead detonating with enough force to vaporize the thin-skinned transporter vehicles and the millions of dollars of support equipment surrounding them. Black smoke rose from 5 different launch sites, the fires visible from space as the liquid fuel components of the DF-26 missiles ignited in secondary explosions. The American retaliation had achieved its immediate goal, effectively silencing the specific brigades that had crippled the Truman, but the cost had been the total expenditure of the strike group's most potent offensive weapon. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, the Philippine Sea was a landscape of fire and metal, with both sides reeling from a level of destruction that neither had fully anticipated. 7:15 in the morning, the airspace 200 miles west of the USS Harry Truman. A flight of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets was orbiting a single KC-135 aerial refueling tanker, their fuel gauges flashing amber in the dim cockpit light. The pilots could see the massive column of black smoke from the Truman rising like a funeral pyre on the eastern horizon, a sight that turned the air in their cockpits into a pressurized vacuum of dread. The environment was one of stark, high-altitude isolation, the sky a brilliant, uncaring blue that smelled only of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic tang of nervous sweat. The tactical situation was deteriorating as a secondary threat emerged from the west. A formation of 16 J-15 Flying Shark fighters, launched from the Chinese carrier Shandong, were closing in to finish what the ballistic missiles had started. The Truman's own air wing was scattered and low on ordnance, leaving the defense of the strike group to a handful of fighters and a detachment of F-35 Bravo Lightning IIs launched from the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli, which was racing toward the scene from the south. The F-35 Bravo pilots, operating in stealth mode with their internal weapon bays closed, were the invisible ghosts of the air screen, using their sophisticated sensor fusion to pass targeting data to the older FA-18 fighters without revealing their own positions to the enemy. The logistics of this aerial bridge were a masterpiece of desperation and precision, requiring a constant daisy chain of tankers to remain within the combat zone. Despite the threat of Chinese long-range air-to-air missiles, every 15 minutes, a pair of fighters would break off from the combat air patrol, nose into the refueling drogue of a tanker, and take on just enough JP-5 jet fuel to stay airborne for another hour. This was a high-stakes shell game played at 30,000 feet, where a single mechanical failure in a refueling probe or a lucky shot from a Chinese interceptor could send a dozen American pilots into the water. The tankers themselves, converted commercial airliners with no defensive weapons, were the most vulnerable and essential links in the logistical chain, their crews flying straight and level while the world around them erupted in fire. The engagement began when the F-35 Bravos identified the lead J-15 formation at a range of 80 miles, using their AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radars. The American pilots did not wait for a visual identification. They executed a coordinated launch of 32 AIM-120, advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, the weapons dropping from the internal bays and the underwing rails with a series of sharp, pneumatic thuds. The sky was suddenly crisscrossed with the white, pencil-thin trails of the missiles as they accelerated to Mach 4, their active radar seekers waking up in the final seconds to lock onto the Chinese fighters. The air was filled with the electronic screams of radar warning receivers on both sides, a chaotic symphony of digital noise that signaled the start of a high-speed slaughter. The J-15 formation broke apart in panic as the first wave of American missiles found their targets, 4 of the Chinese jets erupting into orange fireballs that rained debris into the Philippine Sea 5 miles below. The remaining Chinese pilots attempted to dive into the thick, humid air of the lower atmosphere to lose the radar locks, but the F-35 Bravos followed them down, their superior maneuverability and sensor integration allowing them to maintain the offensive. The air at 10,000 feet was thick and turbulent, the smell of burnt aviation fuel and sea salt mixing in the lungs of the pilots, as they pulled 7G turns that clouded their vision with grayouts. The dogfight was a blurred kaleidoscope of blue water, white clouds, and the sudden, terrifying flashes of exploding engines. By 7:45, the immediate air threat had been neutralized, with 11 Chinese aircraft confirmed destroyed, for the loss of 2 American FA-18 fighters. The surviving American pilots, their hearts hammering against their ribs and their limbs heavy with the fatigue of high-G combat, were forced to immediately return to the tanker orbits. There was no time for celebration. The logistics of getting the remaining aircraft to a safe landing site were still unresolved. The Tripoli was too small to recover the entire air wing of the Truman, and the carrier's own deck was still a landscape of fire and twisted steel. The victory in the air had provided a temporary shield, but it could not solve the fundamental problem of a 100,000-ton carrier that was slowly losing its battle with the ocean. 8:15 in the morning. The Philippine Sea, 500 miles west of the Mariana Islands. The salvage and rescue ship was already cutting through 4-meter swells at its maximum speed of 15 knots, its heavy-lift cranes swaying rhythmically against the gray, overcast sky. The mission was no longer about projecting power or launching strikes. It was a desperate industrial race to keep the USS Harry Truman from sliding beneath the waves of the Pacific. The air around the rescue vessel was thick with the smell of salt spray and the heavy diesel exhaust of its massive towing winches, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-tech environments of the combat ships. It was racing to assist. Behind the grapple, a specialized fleet of ocean-going tugs and the submarine tender USS Emory S. Land followed, in a tight formation, carrying the thousands of tons of steel plate, underwater welding equipment, and high-capacity pumps required for deep-sea repair. The condition of the Truman was a logistical nightmare that defied standard naval damage control manuals. The second missile strike had not only opened a 30-foot hole in the port-side hangar bay, but had also fractured the main fire main and severed the primary electrical bus for the aft section of the ship. This meant that the automated pumping systems were useless in the very areas where they were needed most, forcing the crew to rely on portable, gasoline-powered Pone 100 pumps. These small, noisy machines were being passed, hand-to-hand through smoke-filled vertical trunks, their exhaust adding a layer of carbon monoxide to the already toxic air inside the ship. The question that haunted the strike group commander was whether the structural integrity of the hull would hold long enough for the Emory S. Land to pull alongside and begin the process of external shoring. The logistics of deep repair at sea, under the constant threat of a follow-up attack, required a level of coordination rarely seen since the Second World War. As the Emory S. Land drew within 500 meters of the carrier, it began the perilous process of an underway mooring in open water, a maneuver that involved connecting 2 ships of vastly different displacements while both were still moving. Huge, rubberized Yokohama fenders, each the size of a school bus, were lowered between the hulls to prevent the ships from crushing each other as they heaved in the dockers. Heavy swells. The sound was a continuous, bone-jarring groan of rubber against steel, a mechanical scream that could be heard deep inside the Truman's engine rooms. Once the ships were physically linked, the transfer of industrial-grade repair equipment began. Heavy-duty electrical cables, thick as a human thigh, were slung across the gap to provide emergency power from the Emory S. Land's generators to the carrier's struggling pumps. Teams of hull technicians and underwater divers from the grapple began the grueling task of assessing the damage below the waterline, using thermal imaging and ultrasonic sensors to find stress fractures in the carrier's high-tensile steel skin. The environment beneath the carrier was a terrifying world of darkness and surging water, where the divers had to work in the shadow of a 100,000-ton hull that was shifting and groaning with every wave. They carried specialized cofferdams, prefabricated steel patches that had to be bolted directly to the hull to seal the largest breaches. On the flight deck, the logistical challenge was one of mass and debris. To restore any kind of flight operations, the crews had to clear the jagged, upward-facing petals of steel created by the first missile impact, using industrial cutting torches that hissed with a blinding blue flame. The sailors worked in 12-hour shifts to remove 60 tons of scorched armor plating. The air was a swirling vortex of sparks, black smoke, and the metallic tang of molten steel, the heat from the torches adding to the tropical humidity until men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. The wreckage of the destroyed aircraft was stripped of any usable parts, engines, avionics, and landing gear before the skeletal remains were hoisted by the grapple's cranes and lowered onto the deck of a waiting supply ship for eventual transport back to the United States. By 10 in the morning, the first successful patch had been secured over the hangar bay breach, and the Truman's list had been reduced from 6 degrees to a more stable 3. The internal fires were finally declared under control, though the heat within the ship remained high enough to warp the plastic casings of the electronics. The logistical tether was holding, but it was a fragile connection. The Emery S. Land was now a stationary target alongside a crippled carrier, protected only by the depleted magazines of the Mason and the Normandy. The deep repair phase was a victory of engineering and grit, but it had transformed the strike group into a slow-moving target that was still 3 days of steaming. Away from the nearest safe harbor, 11 in the morning, the Philippine Sea, 60 miles to the east of the wounded carrier and its salvage screen. The replenishment oiler United States Naval Ship Henry J. Kaiser and the ammunition ship United States Naval Ship Alan Shepard were carving parallel furrows through a sea that had turned a restless, slate gray under a heavy ceiling of low-hanging clouds. These vessels, the unglamorous but essential backbone of the United States Navy's logistics power, were the only reason the strike group had not yet been forced to abandon the Harry Truman to the currents. The air between the ships was a chaotic tunnel of wind, thick with the heavy, sweet smell of marine diesel fuel and the rhythmic, metallic clanging of heavy-duty pulleys and tensioned steel cables. To the west, the dark smudge of smoke from the carrier still stained the horizon, a constant reminder that the margin for error in this replenishment operation was exactly zero. The logistics of an underway replenishment in 4-meter swells, with the enemy still potentially tracking the fleet, was a feat of seamanship that pushed the crews of the USS Mason and the USS Normandy to the edge of physical collapse. The destroyer Mason moved into position alongside the Alan Shepard, the two ships maintaining a precise distance of only 180 feet, while traveling at a steady 15 knots. The physical sensation on the bridge of the Mason was one of intense, vibrating tension, as the helmsman fought the suction effect created by the two massive hulls moving through the water in such close proximity. One wrong move, a single degree of rudder error, and tens of thousands of tons of steel would collide with enough force to shatter both vessels and end the mission. The transfer of ammunition was the most critical and dangerous phase of the morning's work. In the vertical launch systems of the Mason, 80% of the cells were empty, leaving the ship with almost no way to defend against a third wave of ballistic missiles. Because the Mark 41 vertical launch system cannot be reloaded in open water using standard methods, the crew had to utilize a specialized, high-priority transfer protocol involving heavy lift cranes and specialized strike-down canisters. The standard Missile 6 interceptors, each weighing over 3,000 pounds, were swung across the gap between the ships on high-tension wires, the white canisters dancing precariously above the churning white water of the gap. Each time a missile cleared the rail of the supply ship, the sailors on the deck of the Mason held their breath. their hands raw from gripping the taglines as they guided the explosive cargo into the open cells. Simultaneously, the cruiser USS Normandy was connected to the Henry J. Kaiser by a web of thick, black fuel hoses that pulsed with the pressure of 1,000 gallons of diesel per minute. The environment on the deck of the cruiser was a sensory overload of noise and chemical smells. The roar of the high-capacity pumps competed with the shrieking of the wind through the rigging, and the deck was slick with a fine mist of atomized fuel and sea spray. The logistics of refueling were not just about the ship's engines. The Normandy also had to take on hundreds of thousands of gallons of JP-5 jet fuel to replenish its own internal tanks, which would eventually be transferred to the Truman's surviving aircraft. The logistical chain was a series of interlocking dependencies, where the survival of the fighter jets depended on the cruiser, which in turn depended on the oiler, which was now operating at the very limit of its endurance. By 12:30 in the afternoon, the transfer was 60% complete, but the mechanical strain was beginning to show on the equipment. A primary tensioning winch on the Allen Shepard suffered a hydraulic failure, causing a 2-ton pallet of 20mm ammunition to swing violently toward the Mason superstructure. The deck force sailors reacted with the practiced discipline of a crew that had performed this maneuver 100 times in training, using manual guide ropes to snub the swinging load just inches before it could impact the sensitive radar arrays. The sweat was pouring down their faces, mixing with the salt spray to sting their eyes, but no one broke rank. The sound of the winch being manually bypassed was a rhythmic, guttural clanking that echoed through the hull, a testament to the industrial grit required to keep a modern navy in the fight. The replenishment was completed just as the first raindrops of a gathering tropical squall began to hiss against the hot metal of the decks. The Mason and Normandy disengaged from the supply ships, with a series of sharp, mechanical clicks as the coupling probes were retracted and the heavy lines were hauled back across the water. The escort ships were now fully topped, their magazines replenished with a fresh load of interceptors and their fuel bunkers at maximum capacity. The logistical tether had been successfully re-established, providing the strike group with the kinetic shield it needed to continue the slow, painful journey toward the repair facilities on Guam. As the supply ships turned away to seek the protection of the deep ocean, the crew of the Mason looked back toward the Truman, knowing that the most difficult part of the campaign, the long transit through contested waters, was still ahead of them. 2 in the afternoon. The headquarters of the Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu, Hawaii. The assessment of the strike on the USS Harry Truman was being conducted in real time by a team of 50 analysts at the Naval War College and the Pacific Fleet headquarters, their findings painting a grim picture of a shifted geopolitical reality. The loss of a single supercarrier, even if it remained afloat, represented the removal of 78 high-performance aircraft and 5,000 specialized personnel from the active theater of operations for a minimum of 2 years. The environment in the secure briefing rooms was one of sterile, high-stakes calculation, the air tasting of stale coffee, and the hum of high-end servers processing the catastrophic data that would dictate the next decade of American foreign policy. The strategic cost was measured not just in tons of steel and the 312 confirmed personnel killed in action, but in the immediate collapse of the United States Navy's ability to maintain a persistent presence within the second island chain. With the Truman out of the fight and the nearest available carrier, the USS Ronald Reagan, still 10 days away in the Indian Ocean, a power vacuum had opened that stretched from the Luzon Strait to the coast of Japan. This gap in coverage allowed the People's Liberation Army to accelerate their blockade of regional allies, effectively cutting off the flow of energy and microchips that fueled the global economy. The logistical reality was that the United States no longer possessed the surplus capacity to absorb such a blow without a fundamental, and perhaps permanent, retreat from its forward deployed posture. The repair estimates for the Truman were staggering, involving the complete replacement of the portside hangar bay structure and the reconstruction of the forward nuclear reactor's secondary cooling loops. Because there were no dry docks in the Western Pacific capable of handling a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier of this size, the ship would eventually have to be towed across the entire Pacific Ocean to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington State. This journey of over 7,000 miles, at a towing speed of only 6 knots, would leave the carrier and its escorts vulnerable to further attack for weeks, requiring a massive commitment of submarines and long-range patrol aircraft to provide a continuous security screen. The drain on the Navy's remaining resources just to save the Truman would effectively paralyze the 7th Fleet's offensive capabilities for the duration of the transit. The technical loss of the Cooperative Engagement Capability, or CEC, nodes on the Truman's Island superstructure meant that the strike group's air defense network was now fragmented, forcing each escort ship to rely on its own limited sensor horizon. This degradation of the Aegis shield made the entire formation an easier target for secondary cruise missile strikes, or submarine-launched torpedoes, a vulnerability that the Chinese North Sea Fleet was already moving to exploit. The environment of the Philippine Sea had been transformed into a lethal corridor where the hunter had become the hunted, and the tactical advantage of the carrier's long-range air wing had been neutralized by a handful of land-based ballistic missiles. The environmental impact of the engagement was visible from low Earth orbit, a 600-mile-long slick of unburned aviation fuel and firefighting foam trailing behind the strike group like a dark scar on the surface of the Philippine Sea. The smell of the time ocean in this corridor had been permanently altered, the fresh salt air replaced by the chemical bite of industrial waste and the persistent, oily stink of the Truman's charred remains. For the regional allies, specifically the governments of the Philippines and Japan, the sight of a burning American carrier was a psychological shock that undermined decades of security guarantees. The logistics of supporting the sudden influx of American wounded into the limited medical facilities on Guam was already overwhelming the island's civil infrastructure, creating a secondary crisis of supply and housing that threatened to spark local unrest. In Beijing, the mood was one of cautious triumph, as the successful employment of the DF-26 had validated decades of investment in asymmetric warfare, though the loss of their own mobile brigades to the American Tomahawk strike tempered the celebration. The logistics of the Pacific had been rewritten in a single morning, proving that the age of unchallenged American naval supremacy had come to a violent and definitive end. The Harry Truman was a survivor, but it was a survivor of a war that had only just begun to reveal its true, catastrophic price. The Harry Truman was a survivor, but it was a survivor of a war that had only just begun to reveal its true, catastrophic price. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, the strike group continued its slow, painful crawl toward the east, a wounded formation that was now the symbol of a superpower struggling to redefine its role in a contested world. 3 days later, high noon on the 15th of January, 2026, the outer breakwater of Apra Harbor, Guam, the USS Harry Truman, a blackened and twisted monument to the lethality of modern naval combat, was being guided through the narrow channel by a flotilla of 6 heavy-duty harbor tugs. The carrier was no longer moving under its own power, its once mighty nuclear heart silenced, and its 4 massive brass propellers still, leaving the ship a 100,000-ton deadweight at the end of a series of thick, synthetic towing hawsers. The air over the harbor was a thick, sweltering blanket of tropical humidity, smelling of coral dust, diesel exhaust, and the persistent, haunting odor of charred insulation that still drifted from the carrier's open hangar bay. On the cliffs of Orote Point, thousands of service members and their families stood in a heavy, respectful silence, watching as the centerpiece of the 7th Fleet arrived at its temporary sanctuary. The logistical operation to receive the wounded carrier was a massive undertaking that had transformed the entire island of Guam into a giant support hub for the strike group. Every available pier at the naval base was cleared, and a specialized heavy-lift crane ship had been repositioned from the continental United States to begin the process of removing the larger pieces of wreckage from the Truman's flight deck. The pierside environment was a chaotic but disciplined hive of activity. with hundreds of ambulances and medical buses lined up to receive the remaining 350 wounded sailors who had been stabilized during the 3-day transit. The sound of the tugboat's rhythmic, low-frequency engines echoed off the limestone cliffs, an industrial funeral march for a ship that had narrowly escaped the abyss. The strategic objective of the campaign to break the Chinese blockade of the second island chain had been achieved, but the victory was a Pyrrhic one that would be studied in military academies for decades. While the 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles had successfully neutralized the immediate ballistic threat from the Guangdong launch sites, the temporary loss of the Truman had forced a fundamental shift in the Navy's defensive doctrine. The strike group had proven that a carrier could survive a multi-missile ballistic attack. Yet, it had also demonstrated that the logistical cost of that survival was so high, it could effectively paralyze an entire theater of operations. The Philippine Sea was now a contested zone where the presence of a supercarrier was no longer a guarantee of safety, but a high-stakes gamble that required the constant protection of every available escort and sensor. The final assessment of the damage revealed that while the Truman's hull remained structurally sound, the internal nervous system of the ship had been shattered by the secondary explosions in the hangar bay. Over 40 miles of fiber optic cabling and high-voltage electrical lines would need to be ripped out and replaced, a task that could only be performed at a specialized shipyard in the continental United States. The logistics of the long tow back to Washington State were already being planned, a journey that would take 45 days and require a continuous security screen of 2 attack submarines and a rotating flight of land-based Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. The carrier would likely be out of the order of battle for the next 36 months, leaving a gaping hole in the Pacific defense architecture during the most dangerous period of the 21st century. As the Truman finally touched the pier, the first of the heavy gangways was lowered with a series of sharp, mechanical clangs that signaled the end of the ship's ordeal at sea. The crew, many of them still wearing soot-stained working uniforms and bandages, began the slow process of disembarking, their faces hollow with the exhaustion of 72 hours of continuous damage control. The environment on the pier was a sensory overload of reunions and medical triage, the bright tropical sun reflecting off the white firefighting foam that still clung to the crevices of the carrier's superstructure. There were no victory cheers. Instead, there was only the quiet, professional relief of men and women who had looked into the furnace of a superpower conflict and survived to tell the tale. The resolution of the engagement was a grim stalemate that left both nations reeling from the sudden realization of what a full-scale war would actually look like. The People's Liberation Army had lost its most potent land-based anti-ship assets, but the United States had lost its primary tool for projecting power in the Western Pacific. The Philippine Sea was silent once more, the waves washing over the debris of destroyed aircraft and the fragments of titanium warheads, but the peace was fragile and temporary. As the sun began to set over the harbor, the silhouette of the Harry Truman was a dark, jagged line against the orange sky, a reminder that in the age of the carrier killer, the only true victory was survival.